Right, so I wanted to make a little video. Had the idea to do this yesterday, and during Paul's live stream, and before that, and got to jump on the end and kind of pitch my idea. But I figured I would do a little bit more of a full treatment here. So a lot of people have been talking about this guy, T. Grogan. Everybody calls him T. Grog, but his handle is T. Grogan, and everybody's kind of been razzing him a little bit because he's a little bit of a troll in the comments, and he thinks everybody's kind of doing a silly word salad thing. And I would say that there is a bit of that kind of thing that goes on in this corner of the internet, especially on the Grail Country channel, which is where time makes it convenient for me to chat a lot, just because of like when Luke happens to have his streams. And what I did while Paul was talking, I just took a screenshot of the chat so I could make sure I got his handle right. But the quote that what he said, the comment that I happened to see, he was talking to William Branch, and he said, "I think it's an act of cowardice to believe things to feel good. I think it's a betrayal of the intellect." And I would agree with that. I think that we people are made very differently, and people have very different personalities and things that resonate for them. And a lot of the people that tend to be in our discussions are maybe people who have found a way to move past some of these issues by like reframing the question. Instead of thinking about it in this and that term, they're having a different conversation. They're moving on. And I got really frustrated one day with this sort of thing in the discussion between Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot, and they were talking to Douglas Murray. And Douglas Murray was basically saying some things like, I don't know if I can believe like in the resurrection of the dead or something like that. And Jonathan Peugeot was kind of framing in this thing of like, you need to reframe your way of thinking about it. And I was very frustrated because clearly that is the solution that Jonathan Peugeot has taken. And, kind of in embracing like the symbolic worldview and all that stuff. But there are trade-offs to these things. And if there are no answers to these questions on the terms in which they cause concern for people, then that's a big problem. There's a big problem. And fortunately, that's not necessarily the case. People have been dealing with these issues for a long time, and people have been dealing with them in the terms that people, as they've been brought up, as these arguments have been presented, people have wrestled with them on those terms. It doesn't always get the major impact or as much notice. It doesn't always shift the needle the same way, but there are answers to these questions that people have struggled with, and they have come up with logical, intellectually consistent, cogent answers to these things. Now, there is an element whereby it may not convince everybody, because your skepticism outstrips your desire to believe, or and so some of this kind of gets into one I'll discuss in here. One thing, the presuppositional apologetic, and in a sense, for those who want to believe, or who believe, like in God, the evidence will be overwhelming. And for those who absolutely do not want to believe, or do not or cannot believe, no amount of evidence will be sufficient, because it's not necessarily about simply weighing evidence. There's something within us that, for lack of a better word, we'll call it faith. But it's not blind faith. It is that we desire to have an internally consistent worldview. We desire to perceive the world in a way that makes sense and make, a interpretation of the data that makes sense. And and so, in good faith, that would be to say, like, perhaps somebody hasn't just had their specific questions dealt with sufficiently. And so I think that we've done a disservice to T. Grogan in our little corner of the internet, because he seems to be wrestling with a lot of questions and has a lot of the objections that have been dealt with and weren't sufficient for many of the people who have grown up in church, perhaps maybe because like their parents had these answers and yet their parents were kind of sucky, or the reason why people leave the church is because of the inconsistency in the way that people, between what people say and what people act. And so like that's a real issue, is emotional and inconsistency, but people like to blame it on the intellectual questions. So anyways, I put together an Amazon list here of some books that have been helpful for me, and interesting, and I think they speak to some very interesting topics. And I thought they would be helpful to somebody who's not who wants to use the tools that they have, the scientific method and all these things, which are valid tools for determining certain truths about the universe and the way that I believe God created it. But either way, if people have struggled within these fields, and I think they've come up with some thought-provoking, compelling answers to things. So I kind of made a list here, and at the top, there's lots of C.S. Lewis. Everybody talks about C.S. Lewis, and he's got such a wide variety of things. I thought perhaps for somebody like T. Grogan, an interesting starting place would be The Abolition of Man, because that is one where he's talking about some of the problems. He's talking about problems within the education system, and really the beginning of this move toward a subjective postmodernism, away from reason and rationality, which starts in the humanities. And so, interestingly, he's an English literature professor, and so he notices that it happens in his field. Now we're seeing where it's already, it's started to sweep into science and technology, and that's going to cause some big problems in the future. So Abolition of Man, I think is a good starting point. And obviously C.S. Lewis has, the Mere Christianities, and those things are good. But, I think that's the one that stands out to me as like maybe somebody like T. Grogan would be interested in that book. It's more about like we have to have a common sense framework for society, rather than trying to convince anybody, because he's kind of saying like within a lot of religious systems or worldviews there was a framework that kind of worked, but now we're kind of like we're knocking out the foundations of just everything with some of the craziness. And then the next one I would recommend is this one here by Francis Schaeffer. It's three volumes in one. The God Who Is There, Escape from Reason, and He Is There, and He Is Not Silent. And here he deals with a lot of really similar concepts. He talks about how there's a way where ideas kind of start in one field and transfer to another. And he blames a lot of mistakes or a lot of the consequences of like what's wrong with the world on religious thinkers who didn't have the intellectual, they were very smart, but basically, I guess you could say in some way they're the precursors of this kind of like workaround, not dealing with the issue, sidestepping the issue. He has a lot of really interesting things to say in there, and he dealt with a lot of the existential philosophers. So I was really interested when I first started watching Paul, because he talks about a lot of the same people that are on like Peterson's list of psychologists and philosophers, and he kind of tracks their influence to society. The third book in that one, He Is There and He Is Not Silent, is more about like there's only a few fundamental beliefs about like how the universe came to be. It's a cosmological kind of argument. You know, is it a personal or an impersonal creation? Is it finite or is it infinite? If it's finite, then that kind of means there's something bigger than the finite thing in which it comes. So he kind of deals with a lot of like how did the universe and the world come to exist, and based on what that is, how well can we trust our conclusions about our own observations and things like that. And that last book it's actually pretty short, and I actually read it out loud on my channel, so I'll put a little playlist in there, so you can have a free audiobook. I think it's also free on Audible. The audiobook is, if you're subscribed to Audible. And then the other book by Francis Schaeffer that I put here is How Should We Then Live? The Rise and Decline of Western Thought and Culture. And this is a really interesting thing, I think, especially for our corner to consider, because he and I'm actually teaching this to our students right now. We're going through it, and we just got to the episode he has on science, because he has a video series that goes along with this, which I will include the link to. It's free on YouTube. And he talks about some of the philosophical choices and the conclusions that came out of Christianity, especially through the West and through the time of the Reformation, is directly responsible for the scientific endeavor. And he talks about like there were hints that science would begin to develop in other places like China and in the Arab world, but it never did. It hit a dead end. And the reason why is not because they hit technological roadblocks, but really because of philosophical roadblocks. They didn't care about some of the, they didn't care about the questions that could be answered, and they didn't push it through. So if you think science is an important way to verify what is true in the world, it really comes out of Christianity and biblical understanding of things revealed in the Bible, what the Bible reveals about God, and what that means about the basic underpinnings of the universe. Basically, that the universe is intelligible and understandable. And that's the basis for doing science, because if it's all just mystical, anybody can come up with anything. And that is a chaotic world. So, it's interesting because, as Jonathan Pageau is saying, you need to reframe the way you're thinking. The whole eastern half of Christianity sidestepped the issue, and they never developed a scientific endeavor. And he points that out in one of these 3 books, so it's really good. So how should we live? How should we then live? Is a historical argument. He starts from the time of Rome and before, and talks about how the changes in worldviews led to the decline of certain civilizations and the rise of others. And the video series is really good. And I'll include that. It's pretty thought-provoking. The next one I put here is The Case for Creator, Lee Strobel. His first book that he was most famous for was The Case for Christ, and he was an investigative journalist. And he basically, did this whole investigative journalism kind of approach to trying to figure out if Christ was real, and what the sources about him say and all that. And it's I actually don't think I ever read that book. I read about it. I read this one. That's why I put this one on the list. He's got a whole bunch of these case for whatever. So they're good. They're good stuff. This one here is Atheism Dead. Eric Metaxas. This is a great book because it kind of gives you an overview of several different areas in which Christian apologetics have started to really provide some thought-provoking questions and some better solutions to some of these problems. So a lot of the things are these cosmological things. Some of them are dealing with things like biology and questions about the origin of life. Some of them are about the physics of the universe and things like that. Other ones are a lot about like archaeology, things like that. And it's interesting because he said in the book he talks about an experience of being he was visiting Greece, and I was thinking about this because we have an eclipse coming on Monday. I'll be able to see it in the full full eclipse where I live, and just thinking about the fact that like the Earth, the moon's like a quarter of the size of the Earth or whatever it is, and the Earth's whatever size it is, and the sun's vastly bigger, and yet it just so happens to be that these three objects are distanced in such a way that they all line up, and with enough variation that we have different types of eclipses and things like that. But like it's basically saying the precision in which these things were placed is very peculiar to just be random chance, and also for us to be in the place where we are best able to observe that phenomenon. So a lot of the arguments that are in this book are the same. They're the same ones that are in Stephen Meyer's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. And I think so. He talks about like some stuff about the origins of life, the fine tuning of the universe is another one, and something else. But most of the arguments for Return of the God Hypothesis are also in the Is Atheism Dead book. It's just a little bit more of on a popular level. In Eric Metaxas's, Stephen Meyer goes into much more detail. And then the last one I put on this list is Making Sense of God by Timothy Keller. And they have the tagline here, Finding God in the Modern World. But the original tagline, I think, was like an invitation to skeptics or whatever. And so he has another book called The Reason for God, for which he was very famous. But this was him trying to take it up a notch and to really take the questions of skeptics seriously. And he's not the source of all the answers. He finds them from various places, but he puts a lot of compelling arguments forth in there. And I thought it was a really good book. So those are some starting places and some authors you could check out. And then I made a little YouTube list. This is more not so much necessarily for these specific videos. Some of them I'd seen, some of them I kind of know what's in there, and I grabbed them. But just more or less to think about the people that are involved in these. They have if you start watching these, the algorithm will provide you with more of them, and you'll get some more stuff. And I just thought of another one I would add probably. Okay, and yeah, let's see if we can refresh it. So this list, one of the ones I put on there was Francis Schaeffer's video series, How Should We Then Live? This is the whole thing in one video. It's 10 episodes, but they just put it into one. So John Lennox, he's got really interesting things to say. He's a mathematician. He's a very rational, reasonable guy, defender of science, thinks that Christianity and God give the best explanation for why we can do science and why it gives us real truths. So that's a good one. Gary Habermas, I put him on for two things. So this one here, the resurrection argument that changed a generation of scholars. This is the thing that he's kind of famous for. It's called the minimal facts argument. And basically it was an attempt to use only the facts that the most skeptical Bible scholars agree on to provide, 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 to an argument for the reliability of what the New Testament claims about Jesus. So it's interesting. The other one I put here is the shroud, the burial garment of Jesus. I thought this was interesting because I'm not Catholic. A lot of Protestants tribalistically disregard things like these relics and stuff like that, but the Shroud of Turin has some really interesting things about it, and it's been subject to a lot of scientific tests that have provided some really compelling, thought-provoking questions as to how it came to be, and there's some debatable things about its age and stuff like that, but there's no, unless if people want to dismiss it, if they really want to be consistent in trying to wrestle with the data, there's some very interesting things to put forth there. So that was one where it was kind of like I had never thought about it much, and then when I saw the data that he was presenting, I was like, wow, that's something to take seriously. And he kind of says like, he's not sure, maybe 85%. 90% maybe that it's real. And other days he's not so sure, because maybe if we discover a technology by where you can fake the creation of such a artifact, then that would lead us to be more skeptical of its origins. The next person I put here is Dr. Lydia McGrew. Her and her husband are both kind of friends of the coroner, I guess you could say, by relation. Their daughter, Bethel McGrew, has been on Paul's channel a few times and talked to some other folks. She's been on Sam's channel, but they're both PhDs, and she's written a bunch of books, and they kind of have this undesigned coincidences argument about kind of a different way for why we can trust some of the claims that the Bible makes, historical claims and things like that. And interestingly, she's very much not a fan of Gary Habermas's argument for the resurrection. And instead, she advocates this maximal data approach, which is the case that is given here in this video by Sean McDowell, with Dr. Jonathan McLatchie. I think Dr. McGrew's done some work with McLatchie. So they kind of explain what that whole thing is. And Sean McDowell, he's got a lot of interesting questions on his channel, because he just deals with that stuff all the time. Whatever questions are bugging people, he'll talk to people about them. This is the Francis Schaeffer video series. I think it's really well done. Well, it's old. It's from 1977. Some of it is amazing in what he predicted in 1977. To me, one of the most compelling arguments is he predicted very, very well the current predicament that we are in back then, because he saw the way history happened and what we were doing now and the direction that we were going. And, that was prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but he was very concerned that, we could be headed to a hot war. And I know you had mentioned that you had read some books about nuclear war, and it's very concerning to you. And I would say that is something that he was sounding the alarm that we should be concerned about as Christians and, people in general. And so that's a really good, he has a lot of really good stuff in there. I'm a big fan. And then the last one I just had added, thought about it, was J. Warner Wallace, Cold Case Christianity. And this is one where he is a detective. He was not a Christian. He had the skills to he worked on a lot of cold cases, so he would go over evidence from eyewitnesses, and basically he has developed some criteria for determining the reliability and the truthfulness of eyewitness testimony. And when he started reading the New Testament and the Gospels, he basically said, this seems like very, based on his expertise, this seems like good eyewitness testimony. It has the ring of authenticity to it, which compelled him to do a deeper dive, and then being convinced that the people saying the things in the Bible were speaking the truth, and the likelihood of them, all colluding, is basically impossible. That they would all get their story straight and be able to lie about it, whatever, or that they would all be deceived, like hallucinations, are too implausible. And so the best remaining answer is that it was true testimony, and that's what led to him becoming a Christian. And so, all these people, are people that had the really hard questions. They've really struggled with these things. None of them are giving you easy believism, and I think all these people would say, use the intellectual tools that you have, use your rigor and, good scholarship and good evidence and good reasoning, and but actually do it, and don't dismiss this stuff out of hand, because if you're going to be consistent, you can't take the atheists scholars seriously and just dismiss what the Christians have to say, because that's not to be consistent. So if that's the case and that's what you want, I think that this could provide some interesting information, and similar for anybody else who's similarly minded. I just think it's important to remember that while a lot of the discussions that kind of happen around this corner of the internet would look at all this stuff and say it's passé and it's cringy, and I get that, especially because a lot of these people are kind of doing the formal debates, and formal debates don't convince people. They pick winners and losers, and the fans of the winners are happy and the fans of the losers are unhappy, or they won't admit that their team lost. So that I agree with that methodology of debating is it doesn't move the needle as far as like progress, but I think it's important for people to understand that even me as a Christian who doesn't talk about this stuff all the time, this stuff's in the back of my head. And so when people come up with me and say, oh, you just believe in a sky daddy and a bunch of ridiculous stuff, it's like, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. I have done the thoughts, I have worked through the problems, and this gives me a more consistent picture of everything. Why humans are the way they are in their behavior, and in our abilities, the good and the bad, and the explanation for the universe, and yet the evil within the universe. I think it's all best explained by the Christian message, and so I don't have to talk about that stuff all the day, but it's the base upon which I stand, and I would say, and then combined with, this also, it gives explanation for the positive, emotional, spiritual experiences, the things that otherwise aren't explainable. This validates the source that says those things come from God. So that's why I trust the Bible, and it's what allows me to have good faith conversations with others. So hopefully this is helpful. If T. Grogan actually gets to see it, I would be appreciative if he takes the time to listen to me, and certainly to check out any of these materials. I think they are all fascinating. I mean, and I still find this stuff interesting, because when it's not about proving that it's true, on the other side of that, from my perspective, I believe that God created the universe, and I believe that ultimately the best, most rigorous scholarship, scientific questioning is going to reveal more and more truth about the way that he did create our universe, and why he did all the things, and why everything in history happens, and all that. So I'm excited. I'm actually excited for the next thing that happens, and for scientific advancement and technological advancement. I mean, I do believe that humans are fallen, and so there's going to be some consequences to some of these things. But ultimately, I think that the future is positive and that it's going to be good. And I think Christianity really it gave the scientific endeavor the foundation in which to get started, and it's only slowed in the fact because of the fact that they've abandoned that base, and I think returning to that base, that the universe is intelligible because it is the creation of an intelligent being, is a necessary component to bring our technological achievements to the next level. And I think very much they could solve a lot of problems of poverty and the problems in the world. But right now the problem is that there's a lot of selfish people and a lot of collusion and a lot of short-sightedness that's infected the scientific community, the academic community, and the people trying to innovate technology. So anyway, I don't want to keep talking. That's plenty long, but hopefully this is gives you something to think about, gives others something to think about, and some resources to check out. So thank you.